Hey everyone, it's Ornlu and Happy New Year! It is January 1st, 2026 when this video goes live, and that means it's time for another year of State of the Civs. This will be the 6th time I am doing this series, but for those who are new or need a refresher, State of the Civs is a short series I do around the start of a new year, where we take a holistic look at all of the civilizations in AoE2 right now, assessing not just how balanced they are, but also how cohesive is their design. Basically, do these civs feel like a natural part of the AoE2 roster? Are they unique? Do they have situations where they shine and situations where they struggle? Do their bonuses feel gimmicky or out of place? That sort of thing. So 2025 was a bit of a tumultuous year for AoE2, especially in comparison to 2024, with the game receiving 5 new civilizations, new regional units, new unique architecture and skins for castles, unique units, monks, and monasteries, and a plethora of balance adjustments, as well as many other small changes. Therefore, for each civilization, I will give a brief overview as to what the civ is all about, then comment as to how well the civ worked last January, list all of the changes the civ received throughout the big 2025, and then conclude with how well the civilization works today. This year, we will need to cover 50 civilizations, so to be able to do them justice, I will be breaking this series into 5 parts of 10 civilizations each. As always, I will be going in alphabetical order, with this video covering the Armenians, Aztecs, Bengalis, Berbers, Bohemians, Britons, Bulgarians, Burgundians, Burmese, and Byzantines. And in case it isn't clear, I will not be covering anything related to the Chronicles DLCs, as they are more of a spin-off than a core part of Age of Empires 2. Furthermore, as of me making this part 1, a new DLC, The Last Chieftains, has been announced for February of 2026 and will include 3 new civilizations for regular gameplay, the Muisca, Mapuche, and Tupi. However, as these civilizations are not in the game yet, I will not cover them until next year's State of the Civs. The same goes for the impending naval rework. It's not in the game yet, so I will hold off all discussion on it until next year. Alright, I think those were all of the logistical points I needed to make, so let's move on to the tier list. As always, this modified tier list is a core part of the series, but I want to remind you that it is mostly just used as a visual way to track and compare the civs. It's not really a competition or power rankings. Before we jump into the civs themselves, I'm just going to quickly review the criteria for each of these tiers, as it's not your typical S through D tier list. At the top, we have the complete tier. These civs feel like core parts of AoE2, iconic, balanced, unique, and possessing noticeable strengths and weaknesses. There are no parts of these civs that glaringly need any changes, from civ bonuses to unique units to tech tree. Next, there is the almost there tier. As you might imagine, these civs are almost to the complete tier, but they have 1 or 2 wrinkles in their design that should probably be addressed. This could be a unit or a bonus or a unique tech, something like that. Basically, the civ is 1 or 2 balance patches away from being complete. Added halfway through my State of the Civs 2024, we have the Power Crept tier. I made this one out of frustration because there were several civs that felt well designed, but were just not powerful enough to be competitive in an increasingly fast metagame. One step down, we have the Something Is Off tier. These civilizations generally make sense, and they certainly feel like AoE2 civs. The issues come from wonky balancing, possessing several units or bonuses that need tweaking, or just have one design aspect that really makes no sense to me. Getting towards the bottom, we have the somewhat problematic civs. Again, these guys make sense generally speaking, but there are really some noticeable issues when it comes to design or balance. It's at this point that the civs really start to not quite feel like AoE2 civs. At the bottom is the Major Changes Needed tier. This is getting to the point where I can identify some pretty fundamental design issues with the civs. Parts of their identity or balance might be there, but there is just a fair amount of iterating that needs to happen before the civ feels complete. And then at the super bottom, we have the Not Civilizations tier, which will only include 3 particular kingdoms. Nah, I'm just kidding. I'm not that mean. We should be good to go now, but I first just need to drop the friendly reminder that these videos take a lot of time to make, so be sure to drop a like if you're hyped for this series, leave a comment as to what you think of the civs we discussed today, and subscribe to the channel for tons more AoE2 content. Alrighty, that is plenty of setup, so let's get into the civs. Beginning now our very long journey, we start with the Armenians. Designated an infantry and naval civilization by the tech tree, Armenians were added in late 2023 as part of the Mountain Royals expansion, and have existed as a reasonably popular pick in tons of different settings. The biggest reason for this is their powerful early economy, with the cheaper mule carts with the better upgrades launching the civ to a quick start in the Dark and Feudal Ages, and then the free relic and warrior priests continue that advantage into the mid-game. Militarily, Armenians have some great early to mid game options with the strong monks, solid cavalry, and even the extra upgraded infantry. This last bonus actually makes Armenians exceptionally powerful on shorefish maps like Morass and Dry River, which we sometimes see in tournaments, as the feudal age longswordsman can be very tough to stop in the early game with lots of food. Late game, Armenians become more limited as they lack powerful ranged, cavalry, and siege options, so you are a bit more reliant on your infantry and composite bowman unique unit. As a water civ, Armenians are among the very best, with the good eco plus extra galley projectile solidifying the civ as a top pick on any map where you need to mass a navy. Notably, they are also one of the best late game naval civs with top tier galleons and heavy demo ships. However, there were a few issues with the civ last year, which caused me to place them in the something is off tier. The civ generally worked, especially on land maps, but they did feel a bit problematic on the water. A strong early, mid, and late game navy is just, in my mind, a little over the top and puts them over some of the other aquatic choices. Warrior priests as well felt only good in early Castle Age for picking up relics. That said, over the course of 2025, there were 4 major balance patches, with Armenians generally going untouched throughout that time. The Civ was definitely happy to see the various swordsman buffs that were added to the game in the early part of the year, but the only direct change to Armenians was the recent reduction in cost of warrior priests from 30 food 60 gold to 30 food and 50 gold. That brings us to 2026 and our first new tier list designation. I would say that Armenians are in a similar spot to 2025 and will continue to place them in the something is off tier, but for slightly different reasons. With the reworking of some other civs on the water, Armenians don't feel quite as overbearing there, although I still would like to see a bit of a tune down to their early game. Still, that feels relatively minor to the modern issue with the Armenians, and that is the warrior priest all-in. These days, there exists a very frustrating rush involving a fast castle into forward fortified churches and warrior priest spam, which is not too fun to deal with. If they are going to go about the route of buffing warrior priests in combat, which I don't necessarily hate, I really do believe that there needs to be some corresponding nerfs to fortified churches. But beyond that situation, Armenians still generally feel pretty good, so they will remain in something is off for 2026. Our next civ is going to be the AOC classic, the Aztecs. Indeed, our first Meso civ was added as part of the Conqueror's expansion, and has always been considered an infantry and monk civilization by the game. Aztecs are very much a known quantity in the community. They are an aggressive civ with some nice early game bonuses to their military and economy, and boast powerful units that are both expensive and fragile. This civ is designed to hit you hard and fast, and to never let go throughout the game. Compared to the other American civs, the Mayans and the Incas, Aztecs possess the most generally powerful economy, at least from a booming standpoint, as well as the strongest units with their monks, siege onagers, and jaguar warriors, but they also have the most lacking tech tree and miss out on a unit discount to help with their cost efficiency. This dynamic is pretty much the definition of a complete civilization based on my own parameters. Unique identity with noticeable strengths and weaknesses, but not forced into any one particular army composition, and viable on plenty of different maps. However, last year I did feel the need to bump them down to the power crept tier, as the meta was just not very kind to the Aztecs, which then featured a ton of defensive cav archer play, and even in aggressive settings, Incas and Mayans were both seen as generally superior. In early 2025, Aztecs got a lot of hype with the major buffs to the attack of the Jaguar Warrior, which now has one of the highest attack units in the game, although interest in the civ has generally cooled off afterwards. They did get another bump in the reversion of the Eagle Warrior food cost back to 20 from 25, but they still feel a bit worse than Mayans and Incas. For that reason, I will be keeping Aztecs in the power crept tier for 2026. I will say that it's pretty close with this civ. Aztecs are still very good on aggressive settings, so if you were to say that the civ doesn't need any buffs, I wouldn't call you crazy. That said, I feel like their booming power should be a little bit better, especially because, like I said, Aztecs miss those unit discounts that the other two American civs possess. Maybe increasing their carry capacity back to +5 to help their early farming might be enough. Other than that though, Aztecs are still a pretty good pick on both open and closed maps, so I wouldn't consider changes to the civ to be a balanced priority by any measure. We now begin the B civilizations with the Bengalis. This elephant and naval civilization will be our first of the Dynasties of India expansion, and man have these guys had their ups and downs. In general, Bengalis are forced to play a bit of a unique style, as they miss any sort of dark or early feudal age bonus, knights, camels, or thumb ring for their archers. Instead, Bengalis are all about big expensive units, with a powerful economy throughout the course of the game with extra villagers, and super chonky expensive units like Rathas, armored monks, and both battle and archer elephants. relevance. Naturally, the Bengalis are a bit tough to play on open maps, as the Civ generally wants to defend, boom up, and trample everything in the late game. Note, that previous sentence does get a big ol' asterisk, which I'll get to in a little bit. That said, a boomy, defensive playstyle does serve the Civ well on closed maps, as anything from Black Forest, Arena, Regicide Fortress, to even some of the more aggressive closed maps that we see in tournaments like Valhalla, all favor the Bengalis' playstyle. Water maps as well are decent for the Civ, although you do have to keep in mind that slower start. Unfortunately, last year I bumped the Bengalis down from something is off to somewhat problematic for one major reason: the Ratha. The Bengali unique unit was just becoming a real headache to deal with on both open and closed maps. On open maps, many people felt the wrath of the Ratha with the so-called Phosphoru builds, where the extra armor and cheap cost made the unit extremely powerful in hyper-fast castle all-in situations. On closed maps, mass Rathas could be very tough to stop in the late game due to their trample damage, on top of all the other things Bengalis have going for them in Imperial Age. In addition, the unit was clunky and annoying to use due to the inability to train them in melee mode and the lack of separate hotkeys for swapping between modes. To their credit, the devs did address some of these issues throughout 2025, nerfing both the HP and training time of Castle Age Rathas and giving the player the ability to have separate hotkeys for those two modes. So where does that leave us for 2026? Honestly, I'm not sure. I think I will keep them in somewhat problematic for a few different reasons. First, the Phosphoru stuff is pretty annoying in general, and Bengalis and Koreans are probably the two best Civs for it. That said, I am not sure if that is a balance issue for those units specifically. I don't even know if the Phosphoru builds are OP. Maybe they're just harder to play against than to pilot. Nevertheless, I do think Bengalis are also a bit too good on non-Arabia maps, and they feel like they push out some of the otherwise good closed map Civs like Burmese and Turks. Still, it's not like Bengalis feel broken or anything. They're a very awkward Civ to balance, and, at least for me, they feel a bit too polarizing at the moment. Next, we have our first African kingdom civilization, the Berbers. This cavalry and naval Civ has become a fan favorite over the years, and it's not hard to see why. A flexible tech tree, strong, fast units, and one of the best all-around unique units all lend themselves to a variety of map types. The themes of this Civ are efficiency and speed, with their most notable bonuses being the faster-moving villagers and ships, as well as their discounted stable units. Compared to other cavalry civilizations, Berbers might not hit as fast as Magyars or Franks, nor are they as strong in late game as Persians and Lithuanians, but rather their strength lies in between. Fully upgraded Hussars, Cavalier, and Camels with a discount give the Civ a ton of options, further aiding them when gold starts to run low. Fitting with this theme, their Camel Archer unique unit is one of the most cost-efficient units out there, and although they lack the DPS of Mangudai, their potential HP regeneration and ability to counter other Cav Archers solidifies the unit as a late-game powerhouse. Of course, the flip side of this is the major weakness of the Berbers, which is the early game. Villager fighting shenanigans aside, the Berbers don't really have much going for them until the Castle Age, where even then they don't have the booming ability of some other Civs. This causes their pick rate in tournaments to always be fairly low on any map type, even as the Civ is at least decent in most settings. This, combined with the clunky implementation of the Genitor as a team game unit, has caused me to place Berbers in the something is off tier every single year I've made this series. That said, the Berbers are a very stable Civ, so to say, and did not receive a single direct balance change throughout 2025. Therefore, it will likely surprise many of you that I will be moving Berbers up to the almost there tier for 2026. Why, you may ask? Well, call me inconsistent, call me resigned to the more problematic Civs in AoE2, but honestly, I feel like I've been too hard on the old Berbers over the years. The Civ is a lot of fun to play, and they are at least viable at all skill levels, even if you aren't jumping to draft them in a tournament. The Civ is good enough that if you want to play Berbers, you can probably make them work anywhere. The only issue I really have with the Civ is the Genitor as a team unit specifically, as they just are not good in a team game setting, and see much less play than Condottieri or Imperial Skirmishers. I would rather just see the Genitor be a unique unit, and then make the effect of Casbah, which is the faster working castles, as a team bonus. That aside, Berbers are really just a fine Civ, and their lack of specific balance adjustments really speaks to their steadiness in an often tumultuous AoE2 landscape. The B Civs continue, next up with the Bohemians. This gunpowder and monk civilization is the first entry from Dawn of the Dukes, and has cannonballed its way into the limelight throughout its entire existence. The reason for this is the Civs' incredible performance on closed maps, where all of their strengths interests converge. If the Teutons are the slow, defensive civ with a big economy and expensive but powerful units, Bohemians are all about either a low-eco, scrappy army, or a passive late-game doom push with cheap units in front of their deadly Hofnitze cannons. Because of these two distinct playstyles, either fast castle aggression or a passive late-game oriented play, Bohemians are a constant pick on any map where you can pull off a fast castle strategy. On low-eco maps like Nomad, Ziwal, or Bosmo, or any other tournament map like that, Bohemians have free mining upgrades, speedy and tanky villagers, strong monks, and a devastating unique unit early on with the Hussite wagon. Yes, Bohemians are one of the best civs for the Phosphorus type rushes, but really any type of clown strategy is great for this civ. Conversely, if Bohemians can hang on, their late game composition on land is probably the single best in the game, and there really are only a handful of civs, like Turks and maybe Mongols, that can keep up with them. Of course, this late game strength does not matter at all on open maps, where their lack of early bonuses or mobility options basically make the civ one of the worst on any sort of Arabia clone. They also don't thrive on water. That really brings us to the crux of the Bohemians issues, and why I placed them in the somewhat problematic tier last year. The civ may have a great identity and coherent bonuses, but they are just way too good on closed maps, and way too bad on anything else. Sure, there are gonna be some civs that are better on closed maps than open maps. That's totally fine. But take Teutons again. They feel much more balanced in that they aren't totally hopeless on open maps, nor do they crush everybody on closed maps. Bohemians just feel a step too extreme as closed map specialists. Still, the only change they received in 2025 was a small nerf to the Hussite wagon secondary projectiles. Realistically, it did not make a huge difference, and I am very much keeping Bohemians in the somewhat problematic tier for 2026. It's just such a frustrating civ to play against on closed maps, and an instant draft pick whenever there is a closed map in a tournament. Meanwhile, they feel so helpless compared to the super fast civs we see on open maps. Throughout this upcoming year, it would be really nice to see Bohemians reined in a bit on either extremes when it comes to viability on different map types. Now we move to the original AoE2 civ, the Britons. This Age of Kings foot archer civ was the very first one coded into the game, and the first default civ on top of being the original one alphabetically. Really, I don't think I need to explain much about this iconic AoE2 civ. On top of being the archetypical archer civilization in the game, Britons have several aspects that continue to separate their playstyle from the newer civilizations even to this day. In general, Britons are more of a gradual archer civilization, focused on booming up, defending, dictating fights, and slowly grinding down their opponent. This is, for example, in sharp contrast to civilizations like Mayans, Ethiopians, and Shu, who are all much more focused on timings and a lower eco playstyle. Obviously, the most famous bonus for Britons is their longer range archers, but they also have two solid eco bonuses with faster working shepherds and cheaper town centers to help keep them competitive in the early to mid game, ideally keeping them alive long enough to get to their huge blobs of sniper archers. So why is it that with this classic but unique identity, I last put Britons in the power crept tier? Well, unfortunately, in early last year, there were just not enough reasons to pick Britons over the other archer options. The meta back then was dictated by timings, light cav, and cav archers, and the limited tech tree of Britons really did them no favors compared to other civs, and the civ was unfortunately a rare sight in high-level play almost anywhere outside of Arabia team game flank. Interestingly, throughout 2025, the meta shifted from aggressive timings back to a bit more passive metagame, relying on skirmishers to defend yourself until you can build up a powerful army. You would think that Britons would thrive here, but unfortunately they just don't, and not receiving any direct balance changes during the year also did not do them any favors. So, as sad as it makes me, I will have to keep Britons in the power crept tier for 2026. There just isn't enough of a reason to pick the civilization outside of team game flanks. Now, power creep is a phrase that is thrown around a lot in the community, but this, to my mind, is a great example of it. Britons have very strong foot archers and a good economy, but this is counteracted by their lack of bonuses to any other type of unit, no bloodlines, mediocre monks, underwhelming cav archers, or access to gunpowder. Britons are a streamlined civ with very clear strengths and weaknesses. Unfortunately, Britons have to go up against Vietnamese, who have an eco that is just as good, and they also have a skirmisher bonus, a bonus to cav archers, bloodlines, and bombard cannons. Britons can just not compete with the power and flexibility of a civ like Vietnamese, and that's just one example. Shu are also supposed to be a streamlined archer civ, but they are so much more overwhelmingly powerful in the early to mid game due to their compounding eco bonus and discounts. Personally, I don't think Britons need many changes, except maybe to give them 10% faster working archery ranges as a civ bonus to help make up for their team bonus nerf. Rather, nerfs and changes to other civs civs would hopefully bring Britons back into the spotlight at least a little bit more. Speaking of power creep, next up is the totally unrelated Bulgarians. This infantry and cavalry civilization will be our first from the last Khans, and man have these guys been under the radar throughout most of their existence. Above all else, Bulgarians are an aggressive civilization, relying on powerful early military bonuses to secure economic damage and map control. Free swordsman upgrades are really nice, especially as men-at-arm rushes are seeing a bit of a resurgence these days, and the cheap blacksmith upgrades are another helpful tool in staying ahead early. Hopefully, you still have some map control come Castle Age, because that's when you can start dropping crep posts all over the place for some excellent map control. Bulgarians are quite limited in their economy, only having a TC stone discount to serve as an eco bonus, and missing the crossbowman upgrade obviously hurts your flexibility. Nevertheless, Bulgarians can reasonably go for infantry, cavalry, and cav archers, all of which are going to be just fine, and then in the late game, those units can be complemented by strong siege weapons and the powerful Conic unique unit. In theory, that leaves the Civ with at least some powerful options throughout the game. Of course, that is the ideal situation, not one you're going to see all that often, much like the Civ in general. Last year, I did place them in the power crep tier, as the Civ really is the poster child for a Civ that is decent, but worse than most other options. In fact, I am sure that if I polled the AoE2 community at large right now as to what the weakest Civ in the game is, I am quite confident that Bulgarians would at least be a top 3 pick at all levels of play. As an aggressive Civ, they are pretty solid, but Civs like Magyars, Japanese, Wu, and Romans are all just as good, and they all have far superior mid-game transitions. As a late-game deathball powerhouse Civ, Slavs have a better eco, Teutons have a better eco and gunpowder, Bohemians just laugh at them, and so on. There just wasn't really a situation where you ever wanted to pick Bulgarians over other options. Forgotten Empires clearly felt the same, as Bulgarians were buffed in 3 of the 4 balance patches of 2025, improving their dismounted conics and adding some versatility to creposts. So that brings us to 2026, where Bulgarians are in a weird spot. According to AoE stats, Bulgarians literally have the second best win rate on the ladder as of making this video, and they were seen occasionally in the recent King of the Desert tournament. That said, when I did see Bulgarians picked in KOTD, they did not look very impressive at all, and I am pretty sure most people would still consider them a bottom 5 overall Civ in the game. It's just a bizarre situation, and another example as to why I don't consider ladder win rates too much when it comes to assessing a civilization's strength, unless the numbers are really whack. Thankfully though, even the best performing civs are at a sub 55% win rate, so it's not like balance is that bad in general. In my view, you have to take a more qualitative look as to how a civilization plays out and how they win or lose games. Unfortunately, Bulgarians still do not pass the smell test, and I will keep them in the power crept tier for 2026. Feel free to call me crazy in the comments. Continuing the B-Civ train, our next entry is the Burgundians. This will be our first of 2 Lords of the West civilizations, with these guys being considered a cavalry civilization by the game. Yes, their cavalry is very good, but I think adding economy or gunpowder as designations would also make a lot of sense. Nevertheless, Burgundians are a civ all about booming, finesse, and timings. Basically, the anti-Franks, which makes a lot of sense from a design perspective. Franks have straightforward bonuses and units, and generally lean on aggression, whereas the Burgundian bonuses tend to be timing-based, setting up the player defensively early on, and then relying on an economy and technology advantage to get the win later on. Of course, these strengths very much lend themselves to closed maps, where Burgundians are a top-tier pick, even giving Bohemians a run for their money. That said, unlike Bohemians, Burgundians are still not as bad on more open maps, and they even saw occasional play in King of the Desert. Still, their weaknesses are super obvious in that they are just not a very fast civ at all, which is basically one of the worst traits to have as a civ if you like seeing daylight in competitive AoE2. In addition, less of a problem, but still notable, is that the Burgundians lack the population efficiency of other closed map powerhouses, and why we actually see Burgundians picked as a flank on Black Forest more often than a pocket. These traits have caused Burgundians to feel quite erratic in their strength and utility, and is why I placed them in the somewhat problematic tier last year. Yes, they weren't as polarizing as Bohemians, but they did have the dreaded button, Flemish Revolution, an upgrade that, if it has no haters, means that I am gone from this plane of existence. However, Burgundians did receive some pretty major changes in 2025, namely to their Flemish Militia unique unit. These guys were reworked so that instead of just being the unit you get with the button, they now can be trained from the barracks starting in the feudal age, serving as a hybrid between spearmen and swordsmen. From a design perspective, I actually love this change, as it helps Burgundians stay alive better on open maps without buffing them even further on closed maps, all the while giving more utility to a very niche unit. For that reason, in 2026, I will actually be bumping Burgundians up to the somewhat something is off tier. Yes, there are definitely still issues with Burgundians. They are still too good on closed maps, and the button will forever be my mortal enemy. However, in most other settings, Burgundians are at least working towards being that viable but not overbearing pick we want to see out of a well-designed and balanced Civ. Burgundians have always had a solid identity as the technical foil to the Franks, but the past year was a nice step in the right direction in bringing the Civ closer to the rest of the AoE2 roster. Another day, another B-Civ, as we now turn to the oft-forgotten Burmese. This monk and elephant civilization hails from the Rise of the Rajas expansion, and has always existed in a bit of an odd spot. If you remember, for many years, these guys were getting some kind of change in every balance patch, all in an attempt to mitigate their defining civilization weakness, the lack of leather archer armor. Being the only Civ in the game without +2 defense for their archers and skirmishers, Burmese were historically so bad at dealing with any kind of ranged unit-centric Civ that the only time they ever saw a ton of play was when their Arambai unique unit was broken. Thankfully, over the years, Burmese have become a much more well-rounded and balanced civilization, one that can be surprisingly useful in a number of situations. Their free wood upgrades is always a solid boost, and the extra attack for infantry is helpful both for a men-at-arms rush and late-game champion and halb spam. Discounted monk techs make Burmese an excellent clowning Civ, and tanky elephants grant the Civ some major oomph in late-game death balls. That said, Burmese have always been defined by their Arambai unique unit. These guys are fast, have a huge ranged attack, and do not require many upgrades to be effective. Basically, a similar role to conquistadors in early Castle Age, even though the units play out quite differently as the game goes on. Unfortunately, all of this talk about dynamic strengths and weaknesses of the Burmese is really just a roundabout way of me saying they are nowhere near good enough to see much play at higher levels. Especially since the other 3 Rajas Civs, Khmer, Malay, and Vietnamese, are all some of the very best Civs in the game on tons of different maps. This meant that Burmese very solidly landed themselves in the power crept tier in 2025, which, to be fair, was a major improvement from where I placed the Civ historically. I was still much happier with the Civ that felt well balanced but a bit too weak, rather than one that was only strong as a gimmick. Still, it seems like Burmese are much less of a priority now for the devs, and they did not receive a single direct balance change for the second straight year. As you can expect, I will still then be leaving Burmese in the power crept tier for 2026. Honestly, for a Civ that has been so weirdly balanced throughout most of its history, Burmese are a surprisingly decent all-around Civ right now, and a few nerfs to some of their Raja's buddies and other high-performing Civs should give Burmese a good many opportunities to be picked in the future. The final Civ for this video will also be the final B Civ, and that will be all-reliable, the Byzantines. This Age of Kings defensive civilization is a fan-favorite, solid choice in most settings, and it's pretty clear as to why. Extra HP for buildings, cheap counter units, and the best tech tree in the game just allow the Civ to thrive in basically any setting. Open maps, closed maps, hybrid maps, water maps, team games, on any of those map types, Byzantines can excel in all of them. Of course, this is not to say that Byzantines are overbearing anywhere. They are still fundamentally a defensive Civ, and that does not serve them well in situations where you really want to be fast and take map control. They have no real eco bonus, and they miss critical upgrades like Bloodlines, Blast Furnace, and Siege Engineers. Nevertheless, Byzantines can claim close to a 50-50 matchup in most settings, and they have a very powerful, if not a bit niche, fan-favorite unique unit in the Cataphract. As expected, I did place Byzantines in the complete tier in 2025 because, well, the Civ just works. They're fun, unique, and powerful without being overbearing on any particular map. They are a Civ you could pick anywhere if you really wanted to play them, but never really had to in order to succeed in any setting. As you would expect, Byzantines received no direct changes in 2025. So for 2026, Byzantines, as reliable as ever, will be our first Civ in the complete tier. Thankfully, we could get a Civ in that top spot before I had to end this part. Now, it is true that pro players often complain about facing Byzantines in tournament settings, but that, I believe, is more due to them being an annoying Civ to face in many situations at the top level, rather than them being overbearing. It's unfortunate that my shortest segments in this series will be on the Civs in the complete tier, because I really do love these Civs. It's just the nature of things. There's just not a whole lot for me to complain about, and honestly, with a Civ like Byzantines, there's not much for me to tell you that you probably don't already know. At the very least, this is a nice high note to end the day. And that, ladies and gentlemen, will conclude our first part of State of the Civs 2026. I know there was a lot of setup at the beginning, but I feel like this is a video series where my criteria needs to be very clear. Beyond that, these videos are always fun to make, and it's always entertaining seeing all of the comments, so definitely let me know what you think of the Civs discussed today. I will try for one part once a week, so look to next Thursday for part 2, which will cover the Celts, Chinese, Dravidians, Ethiopians, Franks, Georgians, Goths, Gujaras, Hindustanis, and Huns. Lastly, I do want to give a special shout out out to my Patreon supporters, with Dan and Jared in the Great Wolf tier, and Liquid Egg Product, Carolyn, Tandoori Knight, Hryru, and Dieter in the Dire Wolf tier. But of course, as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.